The grand ballroom of the royal palace sparkled with 1,000 crystalline lights, each one casting rainbow reflections across the polished obsidian floors. Ambassador stood near the refreshment tables, quietly observing the alien dignitaries as they mingled in their elaborate ceremonial robes. The humans had only recently been accepted into the Galactic Council, and this was their first formal invitation to the annual Convergence Festival. Adjusted his simple black diplomatic uniform, feeling somewhat underdressed compared to the flowing silk garments and jeweled accessories worn by the other species. They were known for their love of luxury and grandeur, and their palace certainly lived up to that reputation. Towering columns of blue marble stretched toward a domed ceiling painted with scenes of ancient conquests, while servants glided between guests carrying trays of exotic delicacies from across the galaxy. The human delegation had been warned about customs before their arrival. The species valued honor, tradition, and most importantly, hierarchical respect. They were a proud warrior race that had dominated this sector of the galaxy for over 3,000 years, building an empire through both diplomatic cunning and military might. Their society was strictly ordered, with the royal family at the apex and elaborate protocols governing every social interaction. Princess stood across the room, surrounded by a circle of admirers from various alien species. She was considered one of the most beautiful and intelligent members of the royal family, with the characteristic silver-blue skin and elegant horn-like protrusions that marked her noble bloodline. Her voice carried clearly across the ballroom as she regaled her audience with tales of recent military victories against the rebel systems. Had been briefed about the princess before the event. At only 230 years old, she was young for nobility, but had already earned a reputation as a skilled military strategist and diplomat. She had personally led 3 successful campaigns to bring wayward systems back under imperial control, and many considered her a likely successor to the throne despite having 2 older siblings. The human ambassador was content to observe from a distance, sipping the mild fermented fruit drink that served as the local equivalent of wine. Earth's first diplomatic mission to the Empire was primarily meant to be a fact-finding expedition, gathering information about galactic politics and establishing basic trade relationships. The humans were newcomers to interstellar civilization, having only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years earlier. A commotion near the main entrance drew attention. A group of merchants had arrived fashionably late, their forms clicking across the polished floor as they approached the princess's circle. They were known throughout the galaxy as shrewd traders and information brokers, with a network of commercial relationships spanning hundreds of systems. Their leader, a particularly large specimen with golden carapace markings, began speaking in rapid, chittering tones. Couldn't understand the language, but he noticed the immediate change in atmosphere around Princess. Her elegant posture became more rigid, and the musical quality of her voice took on a sharper edge. The other guests began backing away slightly, sensing the shift in mood. Whatever they had said was clearly not being well received. The human ambassador moved closer, curious about what could have caused such a dramatic reaction. As he approached, his universal translator began picking up fragments of the conversation. The merchant was apparently sharing news about recent developments in the Outer Rim territories, where several human colonies had been established. Primitive species thinks it can claim entire systems with such laughable technology, the was saying in its buzzing voice. Their ships are barely capable of maintaining orbit, let alone defending territory from serious threats. Princess' silver eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. Yes, I've read the reports about these humans. Rather presumptuous for such a young species to demand representation on the Galactic Council. They've accomplished nothing of significance in their brief time among the stars. Felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained his diplomatic composure. He had dealt with prejudice before, both on Earth and during humanity's first tentative contacts with alien civilizations. Most species seem to view humans as upstart newcomers who needed to prove their worth through centuries of service before being taken seriously. The merchant clicked its mandibles in what recognized as their equivalent of laughter. Their representative is actually here tonight, Princess. Perhaps you could enlighten him about the proper place of his species in the galactic order. All eyes in the immediate area turned toward as the gestured in his direction with one of its 4 arms. The human ambassador found himself the center of attention from dozens of alien dignitaries, many of whom had never seen a human in person before. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, offering a respectful bow in the style. "Your Highness," he said in carefully practiced, "I am ambassador of the United Earth Federation. It is an honor to attend your magnificent celebration." Princess looked him up and down with undisguised curiosity, as if examining some exotic specimen brought for her entertainment. Her silver-blue skin seemed to shimmer under the crystal lights, and could see why she was considered one of the most beautiful members of the royal family. But there was something cold and calculating in her gaze that reminded him of a predator evaluating potential prey. "How interesting," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent portion of the ballroom. "So you are the human ambassador. I must say you're smaller than I expected. Most warrior species tend to be more physically impressive." Maintained his diplomatic smile despite the obvious insult. "Humans come in many sizes, Your Highness. We've learned that strength often comes from sources other than physical stature." The princess laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow managed to be both beautiful and mocking. "How quaint! And what sources of strength do humans possess? I've read your species' history, Ambassador. Endless wars among yourselves, environmental destruction of your home world, and a disturbing tendency toward emotional decision-making rather than logical analysis." Several of the alien dignitaries murmured among themselves, clearly enjoying the entertainment. Could feel his diplomatic training warring with his natural human instincts. The smart play would be to deflect the conversation gracefully and avoid any confrontation that might damage Earth's relationship with the powerful empire. "Every species has its challenges, Your Highness," he replied carefully. "We've certainly made our share of mistakes, but we've also learned from them. That's part of what makes us valuable members of the galactic community." Princess' eyes narrowed slightly as if she were disappointed by his measured response. "Valuable? In what way exactly? You have no advanced technology that we lack, no military might to offer protection or deterrence, no vast resources that aren't already available elsewhere. What possible value could such a limited species provide?" The word limited hung in the air like a physical blow. Could feel the assembled aliens watching his reaction, waiting to see how the human would respond to such a direct challenge. He noticed that even the servants had stopped their activities to observe the confrontation between the princess and the newcomer species representative. Took a moment to consider his options. He could continue with diplomatic pleasantries and try to steer the conversation towards safer topics. He could attempt to defend humanity's achievements and potential contributions. Or he could do something that his briefings had specifically warned against. He could respond with the same directness that the princess was displaying. "Your Highness raises an interesting question about value," said, his voice remaining calm and measured. "I suppose that depends on how one defines worth. If value is measured solely by military conquest and technological superiority, then perhaps humans do fall short of standards." Princess smiled triumphantly, apparently pleased that the human was finally acknowledging his species' inferiority. Several of the alien observers began nodding in agreement, clearly satisfied with the expected outcome of this encounter. "However," continued, his tone becoming slightly cooler, "I've noticed that some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy seem to struggle with concepts that humans consider fundamental. Basic empathy, for instance. The ability to see value in others regardless of their current power or status. The wisdom to judge species by their potential rather than their present limitations." The smile faded from Princess' face as she realized that the human was not simply conceding defeat. The assembled crowd grew more attentive, sensing that the conversation was taking an unexpected turn. "Are you suggesting that lack empathy, Ambassador?" the princess asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "That we are somehow deficient in wisdom?" Met her gaze steadily, recognizing that he had reached a point of no return. "I'm suggesting that true strength comes from the ability to recognize and nurture potential in others, not from the need to constantly demonstrate one's superiority over those who are different or less powerful." The ballroom had grown completely silent, except for the soft humming of the crystal lights and the distant sound of fountain water in the palace gardens. Princess Silverblue skin had taken on a slightly darker hue, a sign of rising anger among her species. "How dare you lecture me about strength?" she said, her voice rising with each word. "Your pathetic little species has existed for barely a cosmic moment, and you presume to judge a civilization that ruled the stars before your world had even developed written language. You are nothing but primitive barbarians playing at being civilized, and the galaxy would be better off if your species had never left its insignificant little planet." The princess's outburst echoed through the grand ballroom, her words carrying to every corner of the vast space. The assembled dignitaries stood frozen, shocked by the naked hostility being displayed toward a visiting ambassador. Even by standards, such a direct and public insult was considered extremely poor form during a formal diplomatic gathering. Felt something shift inside him, a fundamental change in how he viewed this situation and these people. He had come here hoping to build bridges between humanity and the greater galactic community. He had endured subtle slights and condescending attitudes with patience and good humor, believing that time would eventually prove humanity's worth to their alien neighbors. But Princess's words had crossed a line that no amount of diplomatic protocol could excuse. She hadn't just insulted him personally or criticized humanity's current limitations. She had expressed a genuine wish that his entire species had never achieved the stars, that Earth's children should have remained trapped on a single world until they died out or destroyed themselves. For a long moment, simply stared at the princess, his dark eyes reflecting a depth of disappointment that seemed to penetrate her mounting rage. Then, without saying a word, he turned and began walking toward the ballroom's main exit. The silence that followed his movement was deafening. In culture, walking away from a member of the royal family without being formally dismissed was considered one of the gravest possible insults. It was a statement that the person being addressed was so far beneath notice that they weren't worth the effort of continued conversation. Princess stood frozen in shock, her silver eyes wide with disbelief. Never in her 230 years had anyone simply walked away from her, especially not after she had delivered what she considered a devastating verbal attack. The assembled aliens watched in stunned silence as the human ambassador crossed the polished obsidian floor, his footsteps echoing in the crystal-lit vastness of the royal ballroom. Reached the ornate double doors without looking back, his diplomatic uniform making him seem almost invisible against the grandeur of his surroundings. As he stepped through the portal and disappeared into the palace corridors beyond, Princess finally found her voice. "Guards," she called out, her tone sharp with humiliation and rage. "Stop him! No one walks away from the royal presence without permission." But it was too late. Ambassador had already vanished into the labyrinthine passages of the palace, leaving behind a ballroom full of shocked aliens and one very confused princess who was about to learn that humans possessed strengths that couldn't be measured by conventional galactic standards. The crystal corridors of the palace seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions as walked deeper into the ancient structure. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished stone floors, the only sound breaking the heavy silence that had followed his dramatic exit from the royal ballroom. Behind him, he could hear the distant commotion of shocked voices and hurried conversations as the alien dignitaries tried to process what they had just witnessed. Felt surprisingly calm despite the magnitude of what he had just done. His diplomatic training screamed that he had made a catastrophic error, potentially damaging Earth's relationship with one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. But another part of him, a deeper and more fundamental part, felt a sense of relief that he had finally drawn a line that couldn't be crossed. The palace guards who had been summoned by Princess appeared at the far end of the corridor, their ornate armor gleaming under the soft blue lighting. They moved with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers, but noticed something interesting in their approach. Rather than rushing to apprehend him as an escaped prisoner, they seemed almost hesitant, as if they weren't entirely sure what authority they had over a foreign ambassador. "Ambassador," called their leader, a tall with the golden shoulder markings that indicated senior rank, "Princess requests your immediate return to the ballroom." Stopped walking and turned to face the guards, his expression calm and respectful. "I appreciate the princess's request, Commander, but I believe our conversation has concluded. I would like to return to my quarters and prepare my report for Earth Command." The guard commander shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of his element when dealing with diplomatic protocol. In normal circumstances, anyone who had a direct order from the royal family would be arrested immediately. But Ambassador held diplomatic immunity, and the political implications of forcibly detaining him were complex enough to give even a veteran soldier pause. "Sir, I must insist," the commander said, though his tone lacked the authoritative edge that would normally accompany such a statement. The princess was quite emphatic, about your return. Could hear running footsteps approaching from the direction of the ballroom, and moments later a group of alien dignitaries rounded the corner. Among them was Minister, the official who had originally extended the invitation to Earth's diplomatic mission. The minister's usually composed demeanor showed clear signs of strain as he hurried toward the confrontation. "Ambassador," Minister called out breathlessly. "Please, there seems to have been some sort of misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately and resolve any diplomatic difficulties." Turned to face the minister, recognizing an opportunity to handle this situation without further escalation. Minister was known throughout the galaxy as a skilled negotiator who genuinely believed in peaceful cooperation between species. Unlike Princess, he had always treated the human delegation with appropriate respect and courtesy. "Minister, I appreciate your concern," replied formally. "However, I don't believe there was any misunderstanding about what transpired in the ballroom. Princess expressed her opinion about humanity quite clearly, and I responded in the only way that seemed appropriate under the circumstances." The minister's silver-blue features showed genuine confusion. In culture, verbal challenges were typically met with either formal combat or elaborate counterarguments designed to demonstrate intellectual superiority. The concept of simply walking away from a confrontation was so foreign that he struggled to understand the human's motivation. "Ambassador, surely the princess's words were simply spirited debate," Minister said carefully. "Young royals are often passionate in their opinions, but this hardly warrants such a dramatic response. Perhaps if you returned and offered appropriate acknowledgement of your error, this matter could be resolved without further incident." Felt his jaw tighten at the suggestion that he should apologize for refusing to accept insults about his entire species. But he also recognized that Minister was genuinely trying to find a diplomatic solution to what could become a major interstellar incident. "Minister, with all due respect, I don't believe I made an error," said quietly. "Princess didn't engage in spirited debate. She made it clear that she considers humanity to be worthless primitives who should never have been allowed to leave Earth. Under those circumstances, I saw no point in continuing a conversation that was based on such fundamental contempt." Behind Minister could see other alien ambassadors gathering in the corridor. Word of the confrontation was spreading rapidly through the palace, and representatives from dozens of different species were converging to witness the aftermath. The merchant who had initiated the conversation was among them, his golden carapace gleaming as he chittered excitedly to his companions about the unexpected entertainment. "The human shows spirit," observed Ambassador of the Hegemony Worlds, her crystalline features reflecting the corridor lighting. "Most species would have either challenged the princess to formal combat or groveled for forgiveness by now." "Spirit, perhaps," replied the representative, his tentacled form shifting colors in what recognized as amusement. "But also an alarming lack of understanding about proper galactic hierarchy. The princess is third in line to the throne. No one simply walks away from such a personage." Listened to the commentary with growing irritation. It seemed that every alien species in the galaxy was obsessed with hierarchy and protocol, as if the accident of birth or the possession of advanced technology somehow granted moral authority over others. In human culture, respect was something that had to be earned through actions and character, not demanded based on position or power. More footsteps echoed from the ballroom direction, and turned to see Princess herself approaching, flanked by a retinue of royal guards and courtiers. Her silver-blue features still showed signs of the rage that had followed his dramatic exit, but there was also something else in her expression, a kind of shocked confusion that suggested she was still processing what had happened. "Ambassador," she called out as she drew near, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "You will return to the ballroom immediately and apologize for your inexcusable breach of protocol." Met her gaze steadily, feeling no trace of the diplomatic deference that would normally guide such an interaction. Princess might be royalty among her own people, but to him, she was simply someone who had revealed a fundamental lack of character through her words and actions. "Your Highness," he said with deliberate formality, "I believe our conversation in the ballroom covered all the necessary points. I have nothing further to add, and I see no reason to return to a gathering where my species has been declared unwelcome." The princess's eyes widened with shock at his continued defiance. Around them, The assembled alien dignitaries murmured among themselves in dozens of different languages, their universal translators creating a babel of commentary about this unprecedented situation. "You dare to continue this insult?" Princess demanded, her voice rising to echo off the crystal walls. "I am Princess of the Royal House, third in succession to the imperial throne. You are nothing but a representative of a primitive backwater species that has achieved nothing of significance in its brief existence among the stars." Felt something cold settle in his chest as he listened to her words. This wasn't anger speaking or diplomatic gamesmanship. This was genuine conviction. Princess truly believed that humans were inferior beings who deserved no respect or consideration. The realization was both disappointing and liberating. "Your Highness," said calmly, "you've made your position quite clear. You believe that humans are primitive and worthless. Under those circumstances, surely you would prefer that this primitive representative of a backwater species remove himself from your presence rather than continue to offend you with his very existence." Before Princess could respond, turned and began walking toward the palace's guest quarters. This time he didn't wait for permission or engage in further debate. He simply left, his measured footsteps carrying him away from the growing crowd of alien spectators and confused officials. "Stop!" Princess shouted behind him. "Guards, arrest him for violation of diplomatic protocol." But even as she gave the order, could hear Minister's voice interceding urgently with the princess, explaining the legal complications of detaining a foreign ambassador and the potential consequences for relationships with Earth's allies. Reached the ornate lift that would carry him to the guest levels, stepping inside just as the crystal doors began to close. Through the transparent walls, he could see the crowd of aliens still gathered in the corridor, their animated discussions creating a cacophony of sound that followed him upward through the palace's towering structure. As the lift climbed higher, began to understand that his actions would have consequences far beyond a simple diplomatic incident. Word of a human ambassador walking away from a princess would spread throughout the galactic community within hours. Some species would see it as proof of human arrogance and disrespect. Others might view it as evidence that Earth's representatives couldn't be trusted to understand proper protocol. But also knew that there were things more important than diplomatic convenience or political advancement. Humanity's place in the galaxy couldn't be built on a foundation of accepting insults and contempt from species who considered themselves superior. If Earth was ever going to be respected by its alien neighbors, that respect would have to be earned through strength of character rather than submission to arbitrary hierarchies. The lift reached the guest level and stepped out into another crystal-lined corridor, this one decorated with artistic representations of the various species that made up the galactic community. He noticed that humans were not yet represented among the carved figures, a reminder that Earth was still considered a probationary member of interstellar civilization. As he walked toward his quarters, began composing the report he would need to send to Earth Command, explaining why he had insulted one of the most powerful royal families in the galaxy would not be easy, but he was confident that his superiors would understand the principles involved. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Turned to see a single figure following him, not guards or officials, but one of the alien ambassadors he had observed during the evening's festivities. It was Ambassador of the Federation, a species known for their philosophical approach to interstellar relations. "Ambassador," called out in his musical voice, "might I have a word with you?" Paused, curious about what this particular alien might want to discuss. They were one of the few species that had shown genuine interest in human culture and philosophy, and had a reputation as a thoughtful observer of galactic politics. "Of course, Ambassador," replied, "though I should warn you that I may not be the best company this evening." His features showed what had learned to recognize as amusement among his species. "On the contrary, I believe you may be exactly the company I was hoping to find. What you did in there," walking away from the princess. "It was either the most foolish or the most courageous act I've witnessed in decades of diplomatic service." Considered the comment carefully. "I'm still trying to decide which one myself." Perhaps, suggested with a slight smile, "It was both." Ambassador followed into the human quarters, his tall, ethereal form moving with the fluid grace characteristic of physiology. The guest chambers were luxuriously appointed by galactic standards, with crystal windows offering a panoramic view of the capital city sprawling beneath twin moons. gestured toward one of the floating chairs that adjusted automatically to accommodate different alien anatomies. "I must admit," said as he settled into the chair, "I've never seen anyone simply walk away from a member of the royal family. Most ambassadors would have either challenged the princess to formal combat or spent the next hour delivering elaborate speeches about their species' achievements and noble heritage." Moved to the window, looking out over the alien cityscape with its soaring spires and flowing architectural curves. The lights of millions of inhabitants created a glittering tapestry that stretched to the horizon, a testament to the advanced civilization that they had built over thousands of years. "Perhaps that's exactly the problem," replied thoughtfully. "Everyone seems to believe that worth must be proven through either violence or boastful rhetoric. The idea that someone might simply choose not to engage with disrespect seems to confuse people." His crystalline features shifted in what had learned was the equivalent of nodding. "They have a saying, the tree that bends in the storm survives, but the tree that stands firm teaches the wind respect. Your actions tonight reminded me of that wisdom." Through the crystal walls, could hear the distant sounds of continued commotion from the lower levels of the palace. Word of the confrontation was clearly spreading, and he could only imagine the diplomatic chaos that was probably unfolding in meeting rooms throughout the building. "Ambassador," said, turning from the window, "can I ask you something? In your experience with galactic politics, is it normal for species to be judged so harshly for their youth or current limitations? I mean, every civilization had to start somewhere, right?" Was quiet for a long moment, his luminescent eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the windows. "That's a profound question, Ambassador, and unfortunately the answer is both yes and no." Raised an eyebrow, encouraging the to continue. "Yes, in the sense that the galaxy is dominated by ancient civilizations that have forgotten what it was like to be young and struggling. The hegemony worlds, the empire, they've all been spacefaring for thousands upon thousands of years. To them, a species that has only been among the stars for 50 years is barely more than an infant." Paused, his expression becoming more serious. "But no, in the sense that this attitude represents a failure of wisdom and imagination. Remember our early days among the stars, when we were dismissed by older species as philosophical dreamers with no practical value. We learned that true strength comes not from age or current power, but from adaptability, creativity, and the courage to grow." Felt a surge of gratitude toward the ambassador. It was the first time since arriving at the palace that an alien representative had spoken about humanity with genuine respect and understanding. "The question now," continued, "is what consequences your actions will have. Princess is not known for forgiveness, and the Empire has considerable influence throughout this sector of the galaxy." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Moved to the door's viewing panel and saw a delegation of officials approaching, led by minister and flanked by what appeared to be senior military officers. "It seems we're about to find out," said quietly. The door chimed with an incoming communication request and activated the response system. Minister's voice came through the speaker, formal and strained. "Ambassador, I must request an immediate meeting to discuss the evening's events. This is a matter of considerable urgency." Looked at, who made a subtle gesture indicating that the ambassador should probably not be present for whatever was about to transpire. Rose from his chair with fluid grace. "Ambassador," he said formally for the benefit of anyone who might be monitoring the conversation, "thank you for the enlightening discussion. I look forward to continued diplomatic cooperation between our peoples." But as he moved toward the door, leaned closer to and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever they threaten you with, remember that you have more allies than you realize. The galaxy is watching how this situation unfolds, and not everyone agrees with the princess's assessment of humanity." Departed just as minister and his delegation entered the guest quarters. The minister looked deeply uncomfortable, while the military officers maintained the stoic expressions that seemed to be required of their profession. Noticed that their ceremonial weapons remained in their sheaths, suggesting that this was still being treated as a diplomatic rather than military matter. "Ambassador," minister began without preamble, "I'm afraid that Princess has lodged formal charges against you for violation of diplomatic protocol and showing disrespect to the royal family. Under normal circumstances, Such charges would result in immediate expulsion from space and termination of all diplomatic relations with your species. Felt his heart sink, but he maintained his composure. He had known that his actions might have serious consequences, but hearing them stated so bluntly still came as a shock. However, the minister continued, there are certain complications to this situation that require careful consideration. One of the military officers stepped forward, introducing himself as General or of the Imperial Guard. His features and numerous decorations indicated extensive combat experience and could see intelligence and caution in his eyes. Ambassador, the general said, I've been monitoring communications from across the galaxy since word of tonight's incident began spreading. The reaction has been unexpected. Waited for elaboration, not sure whether this was good news or bad news. It seems, General or continued, that your response to Princess has caught the attention of several major powers. The Federation has formally requested that any disciplinary action be postponed pending further investigation. The hegemony worlds have expressed interest in hearing humanity's side of the story. Even the notoriously neutral council has sent observers to monitor the situation. Minister looked even more uncomfortable as he added, furthermore, we've received preliminary reports that several species are reconsidering their own relationships with the Empire based on how this matter is resolved. Tried to process this information. It seemed impossible that his simple act of walking away from an insult could have attracted such widespread attention, but apparently the galactic community was more interested in humanity than Earth's leaders had realized. What exactly are you telling me, Minister? Asked carefully. What we're telling you, came a new voice from the doorway, is that your little tantrum has created a political crisis that extends far beyond this palace. Everyone turned to see Princess entering the quarters without invitation, her royal guards maintaining position in the corridor. Her silver-blue features still showed signs of anger, but there was also something else now, a kind of calculating assessment that suggested she was beginning to understand the broader implications of the evening's events. Your Highness, Minister said with obvious discomfort, perhaps this matter would be better discussed through official channels. No, Princess said sharply, her eyes fixed on. I want to hear from this human directly. I want to understand what he hoped to accomplish by showing such blatant disrespect to our customs and traditions. Met her gaze steadily, feeling none of the diplomatic deference that had been drilled into him during his training. After everything that had transpired, he saw no point in pretending that their relationship could return to normal diplomatic protocols. Your Highness, he said calmly, I didn't set out to accomplish anything beyond maintaining my own dignity. You made it clear that you consider my entire species to be worthless primitives. Under those circumstances, I saw no value in continuing a conversation that was based on such fundamental disrespect. Princess' eyes flashed with renewed anger. Disrespect? I spoke only the truth about humanity's limitations and achievements. If you cannot handle honest assessment of your species' shortcomings, perhaps you are not suited for diplomatic service. There's a difference between honest assessment and deliberate insult, replied. You didn't critique specific policies or point out areas where humanity could improve. You declared that the galaxy would be better off if my people had never achieved space flight. That's not diplomacy, that's bigotry. The word bigotry seemed to hit Princess like a physical blow. In galactic politics, accusations of prejudice based on species origin were considered among the most serious diplomatic charges possible. The assembled officials looked shocked that a human ambassador would dare to level such an accusation against a member of the royal family. How dare you, Princess whispered, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. How dare you accuse me of bigotry when you know nothing about our culture or history? Felt a moment of doubt, wondering if he had finally gone too far. But then he remembered her words in the ballroom, her dismissive tone and the genuine contempt in her voice when she spoke about humanity. Your Highness, he said quietly, I may not know much about history, but I know bigotry when I hear it. And what you expressed tonight wasn't cultural superiority or honest criticism. It was pure prejudice against a species you've decided isn't worthy of basic respect. The silence that followed his words was deafening. General and Minister exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that this confrontation had moved far beyond normal diplomatic protocols into uncharted territory. Princess stared at for a long moment, her silver-blue features cycling through a range of emotions that he couldn't quite interpret. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "You realize that what you've just said could be considered an act of war." Felt his blood turn cold, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Your Highness, I've stated my honest assessment of your behavior. If that constitutes an act of war in your culture, then perhaps this conversation demonstrates exactly why humanity and the Empire may not be compatible allies." For a moment that stretched into eternity, Princess stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes locked in a battle of wills that seemed to encompass everything that had transpired between them. Around them, the assembled officials waited to see which way this unprecedented confrontation would resolve. Then, to everyone's shock, Princess began to laugh. Princess' laughter filled the crystal chambers, but it wasn't the mocking sound that had heard in the ballroom. This was something different, surprised, almost wondering, as if she had discovered something completely unexpected. The assembled officials looked as confused as felt, clearly unable to interpret their princess's reaction. "Fascinating," she said as her laughter subsided, studying with renewed interest. "Do you know, Ambassador, that in my 230 years, no one has ever called me a bigot to my face, not even my political enemies or rival claimants to the throne." Wasn't sure how to respond to that. The princess's tone had shifted completely from the angry confrontation of moments before, becoming almost conversational. But he could see the sharp intelligence in her silver eyes, and he sensed that this might be even more dangerous than her previous rage. "Perhaps, Your Highness," he said carefully, "that says more about the people around you than it does about my boldness." Princess raised an elegant eyebrow, her expression becoming thoughtful. "Explain." General or stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. "Your Highness, perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more formal setting, with proper protocols and advisors." "No," Princess said sharply, never taking her eyes off. "I want to hear what the human has to say. Explain your statement, Ambassador." Took a deep breath, recognizing that he was walking into an intellectual minefield. But something about the princess's changed demeanor suggested that she might actually be willing to listen, rather than simply waiting for an opportunity to escalate the confrontation. "Your Highness, in human culture we have a saying, 'Power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely.' When someone reaches your level of authority and status, most people become very careful about what they say to you. They tell you what you want to hear or what they think will advance their own interests." Princess' features showed genuine curiosity. "And you believe this has affected my perception of other species?" "I think," said slowly, "that you've been surrounded by people who validate your prejudices rather than challenging them. When you expressed contempt for humanity tonight, every alien in that ballroom either agreed with you or remained silent. That's not because you were necessarily right. It's because disagreeing with you would have been politically dangerous." Minister looked increasingly nervous as the conversation continued. "Ambassador, perhaps we should focus on resolving the immediate diplomatic crisis rather than engaging in philosophical discussions." "No," Princess said again, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "This is more interesting than anything I've heard in years. Continue, Ambassador." Glanced at the assembled officials, all of whom seemed deeply uncomfortable with their princess engaging in serious intellectual discourse with someone who had just accused her of bigotry. But he could see genuine engagement in her eyes for the first time since their confrontation began. "Your Highness, when you spoke about humanity tonight, you cited our brief time among the stars, our technological limitations, and our history of conflict. All of those things are factually accurate, but you used those facts to reach a conclusion that wasn't supported by the evidence." "Which conclusion was that?" "That humans have no value to the galactic community, that our species would be better off confined to Earth or eliminated entirely." Paused, choosing his words carefully. "That conclusion wasn't based on objective analysis. It was based on prejudgment that younger species are inherently worthless." Princess was quiet for a long moment, her silver-blue features reflecting the moonlight streaming through the crystal windows. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "And what value do you believe humanity brings to the galaxy, Ambassador?" Had been waiting for this question since the confrontation began. It was the fundamental challenge that every human diplomat faced when dealing with advanced alien civilizations. How to demonstrate worth that couldn't be measured in traditional military or technological terms. Your Highness, human value comes from our perspective, not our achievements. We're young enough to remember what it was like to be primitive and struggling. We haven't forgotten the importance of growth and change. We still believe that every species has potential, regardless of their current limitations. Princess tilted her head slightly, a gesture that was beginning to recognize as thoughtful consideration. Elaborate. When the first achieved space flight 3,000 years ago, they were dismissed by older civilizations as impractical philosophers. Today, they're recognized as some of the diplomatic advisors in the galaxy. When the hegemony worlds were young, they were considered violent barbarians. Now they're respected as one of the most stable governments in known space. Moved closer to the window, gesturing toward the sprawling city below. Even though we're once young and inexperienced, but someone somewhere gave your ancestors a chance to prove their worth instead of dismissing them as worthless primitives. An interesting historical perspective, Princess acknowledged. But history is also full of species that never developed beyond their primitive origins. How does the galaxy distinguish between species with potential and those destined to remain limited? It was a fair question, and recognized the trap inherent in it. If he argued that all species had unlimited potential, he would sound naive. If he agreed that some species were naturally limited, he would undermine his own argument about human worth. Your Highness, he said slowly, I think the question itself reveals the problem. When we try to predict a species' ultimate potential based on their current state, we're essentially playing God with their future. We're deciding who deserves opportunity and who doesn't based on our own limited understanding. Princess' eyes sharpened with interest. You're suggesting that such judgments are inherently flawed. I'm suggesting that they're inherently arrogant, replied. No civilization, no matter how advanced, has the wisdom to accurately predict another species' development over thousands of years. The variables are too complex, the possibilities too numerous. General or stepped forward again, his features showing concern. Your Highness, these philosophical discussions are all very interesting, but we still have practical matters to address. The formal charges against Ambassador, the diplomatic crisis, the broader political implications. Princess waved dismissively. The charges can wait, General. This conversation is providing more insight into human psychology than any intelligence report I've ever read. She turned back to with renewed intensity. So you believe that humanity's youth is actually an advantage rather than a weakness? I believe, said carefully, that humanity's youth gives us a perspective that older civilizations may have lost. We remember what it feels like to struggle against limitations. We understand the importance of persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. We haven't forgotten how to hope for something better. Hope, Princess repeated, as if the word were foreign to her. An interesting concept. And you believe this hope has practical value in galactic politics. Thought about Earth's history, about the countless times that human civilization had faced seemingly insurmountable challenges and found ways to overcome them. About the determination that had driven them from caves to space flight in just a few thousand years. Your Highness, hope drives innovation. It motivates species to attempt things that conventional wisdom says are impossible. Every major breakthrough in galactic history has come from someone who refused to accept that the current limitations were permanent. Princess moved to the window herself, gazing out at the city that represented of achievement. And you believe that humans possess this quality of hope more than older species? I believe that we haven't had enough time to lose it yet, replied honestly. When a species has been powerful for thousands of years, they may forget what it's like to need hope for survival. They may become complacent about their current position and abilities. The princess was quiet for several minutes, apparently lost in thought as she watched the lights of her people's city. The assembled officials waited nervously, clearly unsure how to interpret their ruler's extended contemplation. Finally, Princess turned back to face. Ambassador, you've presented an intriguing argument about human potential and the value of hope. But you've also fundamentally challenged the basis of galactic civilization, which is built on the leadership of proven, established powers. Felt his heart rate increase as he recognized the gravity of what she was saying. Your Highness. If younger species should be judged by their potential rather than their achievements, if hope and perspective are more valuable than power and stability, then the entire structure of galactic politics may be fundamentally flawed. Her silver eyes met his directly. You're essentially arguing that species like humanity should have equal voice with ancient civilizations like mine. The implications of her statement hung in the air like a challenge. Realized that their conversation had moved far beyond the personal confrontation that had started in the ballroom. They were now discussing the fundamental principles that governed relationships between species throughout the galaxy. Your Highness, he said quietly, I'm not arguing for any specific political arrangement. I'm simply suggesting that worth shouldn't be determined solely by age and current power. Every species should have the opportunity to prove their value through their actions rather than being prejudged based on their limitations. Princess smiled, and for the first time since their confrontation began, there was no mockery or calculation in the expression. Ambassador, you've managed to do something that I thought was impossible. What's that, Your Highness? You've made me question assumptions that I've held for over 2 centuries. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. The question now is whether the galaxy is ready for the implications of your philosophy. Before could respond, urgent chiming sounds began echoing through the palace communication system. General Orr immediately activated his personal communicator, his expression becoming grim as he listened to the incoming reports. Your Highness, he said urgently, we have a situation. Long-range sensors are detecting massive fleet movements throughout this sector of the galaxy. Multiple species are mobilizing their military forces. Princess' diplomatic curiosity instantly transformed into the focused attention of a military commander. Explain. It appears, General Orr said grimly, that word of tonight's confrontation has spread further and faster than we anticipated. Several major powers are interpreting this as a potential crisis that could destabilize the entire galactic balance of power. Felt the blood drain from his face as he began to understand the magnitude of what his simple act of defiance might have triggered. What had seemed like a personal matter between himself and Princess was apparently being viewed by the galactic community as something far more significant. How many fleets are mobilizing? Princess asked sharply. General Orr consulted his communicator again. At least 7 major powers, Your Highness. The Federation, the Hegemony Worlds, the Empire, the Council. And according to our intelligence sources, Earth has activated its entire space fleet and is sending it towards space. The crystal chambers fell silent as everyone processed this information. What had begun as a diplomatic incident between 2 individuals was apparently on the verge of becoming an interstellar crisis, involving most of the major powers in the galaxy. Princess looked at with an expression that combined respect, concern, and something that might have been admiration. It seems, Ambassador, that your species possesses even more influence than either of us realized. The crystal chambers of the palace had been transformed into an impromptu war room, with holographic displays showing fleet positions throughout the galactic sector. Military advisors hurried back and forth carrying urgent reports, while communication channels crackled with incoming messages from across known space. Stood near the central tactical display, watching in stunned disbelief as the consequences of his simple act of defiance continued to unfold. Earth Fleet Command reports 12 dreadnoughts and 40 escort vessels en route to the system, announced a communications officer. Estimated arrival time, 18 hours. Princess studied the tactical data with the focused intensity of an experienced military strategist. Her earlier philosophical curiosity had been replaced by the practical concerns of someone who suddenly found herself at the center of a potential interstellar war. What about the other powers? She asked General Orr. The Federation has positioned diplomatic vessels at key jump points throughout the sector, apparently ready to intervene if hostilities break out, the general reported. The Hegemony Worlds are maintaining defensive formations but haven't made any aggressive moves. The Empire, they're being typically unpredictable. Their fleets are moving, but we can't determine their intentions. Felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. Hundreds of warships were moving through space because he had chosen to walk away from an insult rather than endure it diplomatically. Thousands of lives could be at stake if this situation escalated into actual combat. Your Highness, he said quietly, Perhaps I should contact my government and ask them to recall their fleet. This was never intended to become a military crisis. Princess turned to look at him, her silver-blue features showing a complexity of emotions that he was still learning to interpret. Ambassador, I don't think you understand what's really happening here. Before could ask for clarification, Minister approached with a worried expression and a data pad covered with urgent communications. Your Highness, the minister said, we're receiving formal diplomatic inquiries from over 30 different species. They're all asking the same basic question: how the Empire responds to ambassadors' actions will determine their future relationships with us. Princess raised an eyebrow. Explain. It appears, Minister continued nervously, that many species have been watching humanity's integration into galactic civilization as a test case. They want to see whether established powers like ours are willing to accept newcomers as equals, or whether we view them as permanent inferiors. Began to understand why his actions had attracted such widespread attention. It wasn't just about humanity's relationship with the Empire. It was about the fundamental question of whether young species could ever achieve true equality in galactic politics. What kinds of species are making these inquiries? Princess asked. Minister consulted his data pad. Primarily younger civilizations, but also some established powers that have apparently been reconsidering the current galactic order. The Federation has formally stated that how we handle this situation will influence their future cooperation with the Empire. General Orr looked up from his tactical displays with concern. Your Highness, if we're facing the possibility of widespread diplomatic isolation, we need to consider our military options carefully. The Empire is powerful, but not powerful enough to stand against a coalition of multiple major powers. Princess was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the strategic implications of the situation. Could see her weighing different factors: military strength, political consequences, economic relationships, and dozens of other variables that determine the balance of power in galactic civilization. Ambassador, she said finally, it seems that your simple act of defiance has accidentally triggered a fundamental crisis in interstellar relations. The question now is how we resolve this situation without anyone getting killed. Nodded grimly, what options do we have? Well, Princess said with a slight smile that held no humor, I could have you executed for disrespecting the royal family. That would satisfy traditional protocol and might convince some species that the Empire maintains proper standards of dignity. The casual mention of execution sent a chill through spine, but he forced himself to remain calm. And the downside of that approach? The downside, she continued, is that it would probably trigger an immediate military response from Earth and possibly several other powers. The galaxy would burn, but at least traditional hierarchy would be maintained. General Orr looked deeply uncomfortable with this line of discussion. Your Highness, surely there are less extreme options. Of course there are, Princess replied. I could offer a formal apology to Ambassador and Earth Command, acknowledging that my initial statements were inappropriate and that humanity deserves full respect as an equal member of the galactic community. Felt a surge of hope, but the princess's tone suggested that this option also had significant drawbacks. The problem with that approach, she continued, is that it would be seen as capitulation to pressure from younger species. Every ambitious civilization in the galaxy would view it as proof that the established powers can be intimidated into changing their policies. Minister cleared his throat nervously. Your Highness, there might be a third option that we haven't considered. Princess gestured for him to continue. What if we treated this entire situation as an opportunity rather than a crisis? The minister suggested. Ambassador's arguments about the value of hope and fresh perspective. What if we took them seriously and proposed fundamental changes to how galactic civilization operates? The suggestion hung in the air like an explosive device waiting to detonate. Could see the assembled military officers exchanging glances of alarm, clearly concerned about the implications of such radical thinking. Elaborate, Princess said quietly. Minister seemed to gather courage from her attention. Your Highness, the current galactic order was established thousands of years ago when there were only a handful of space-faring civilizations. But now there are hundreds of species among the stars, and many of them feel excluded from meaningful participation in interstellar politics. watched Princess face carefully, trying to gauge her reaction to these ideas. Her expression was unreadable, but he could see the sharp intelligence working behind her silver eyes. "You're suggesting that we use this crisis to propose a restructuring of galactic governance?" she asked. "I'm suggesting," Minister said boldly, "that the Empire could position itself as a leader in creating a more inclusive form of interstellar civilization. Instead of being seen as defending outdated hierarchies, we could be the ones proposing progressive reforms." General Or looked alarmed. "Minister, such changes could undermine the Empire's position as a dominant power. If we give equal voice to hundreds of younger species, our influence would be diluted to almost nothing." "Or," Princess said thoughtfully, "our influence could be enhanced by being seen as wise enough to evolve with changing circumstances." Found himself holding his breath as he watched the princess work through the implications of what was being discussed. The fate of interstellar civilization, and possibly his own life, seemed to hang in the balance of her decision. "Ambassador," Princess said suddenly, "you started this crisis with a simple act of walking away from what you perceived as disrespect. If you had the power to reshape galactic civilization to prevent such conflicts in the future, what would you do?" The question was so unexpected that took several moments to formulate a response. He realized that she was essentially asking him to design a new form of interstellar government on the spot. "Your Highness," he said slowly, "I think the fundamental problem is that current galactic politics assumes that age and power automatically grant wisdom and moral authority. But history shows that the opposite is often true. Established powers often become complacent and lose touch with the realities faced by younger civilizations." Princess nodded encouragingly. "Continue." "What if," said, his excitement growing as the ideas took shape, "galactic governance was based on demonstrated wisdom and moral leadership rather than military strength or technological advancement? What if species earned influence through their ability to solve problems, build cooperation, and help other civilizations develop? A meritocracy based on moral achievement rather than material power," Princess mused. "Interesting, but how would such a system be implemented and maintained?" Felt the weight of history in this moment. Decisions made in this crystal chamber could determine the future of dozens of civilizations for thousands of years to come. "Your Highness, I think it would require established powers like the Empire to voluntarily share authority with younger species, proving that true strength comes from the ability to nurture others rather than dominate them." Princess was quiet for a long time, her silver-blue features reflecting the holographic displays that showed fleets maneuvering throughout the sector. Finally, she began to smile, not the mocking expression had seen in the ballroom, but something genuine and almost excited. "Ambassador," she said, "you've managed to do something even more impressive than triggering an interstellar crisis." "What's that, Your Highness?" "You've given me a vision of a future worth fighting for." She turned to address the assembled officials. "General, or contact the Imperial fleet and order them to stand down to defensive positions only. Minister, prepare diplomatic communications to all the species involved in this situation." Felt a surge of relief and hope, but Princess wasn't finished. "We're going to invite every major power in this sector to participate in a grand conference here on," she announced. "We're going to use this crisis as an opportunity to propose fundamental reforms to galactic civilization. An ambassador here is going to help us design a new form of interstellar cooperation based on moral leadership rather than military dominance." General Or looked stunned. "Your Highness, such changes would transform the entire structure of known space, the political implications." "The political implications," Princess said with growing enthusiasm, "are exactly why this is so important. We can either cling to outdated systems that create constant conflict between old and new civilizations, or we can have the courage to build something better." She turned back to with an expression of genuine respect. "Ambassador, you walked away from my insults because you believed that dignity and self-respect were more important than political convenience. Now I'm asking you to help us create a galaxy where no species has to choose between respect and diplomacy." Felt the magnitude of what was being offered, the opportunity to help reshape interstellar civilization itself. But he also understood the risks involved. If they failed, the resulting chaos could set back galactic cooperation for. "Your Highness," he said quietly, Are you sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back to the way things were. Princess' smile became radiant with possibility. Ambassador, that's exactly the point. The way things were led to tonight's confrontation. If we want to prevent future conflicts between established and emerging civilizations, we need to build something completely new. She gestured toward the tactical displays showing the mobilized fleets. All of those ships out there represent the potential for either devastating war or unprecedented cooperation. The choice is ours. Looked around at the assembled officials, seeing mixtures of concern, excitement, and determination on their alien features. Then he thought about Earth, about humanity's long journey from caves to stars, and about the hope that had driven his species through every impossible challenge they had faced. Your Highness, he said firmly, humanity would be honored to help build a better future for all galactic civilizations. As if responding to their decision, the communication systems throughout the palace began chiming with incoming messages from across the galaxy. Species that had been preparing for war were now asking to participate in the proposed conference. The crisis that had begun with a simple act of walking away was transforming into something none of them had dared to imagine. Princess moved to the central command console and began composing a message that would be transmitted to every major civilization in known space. Citizens of the galaxy, she began, tonight we stand at a crossroads between the past and the future. We invite you to join us in building a new form of interstellar civilization based on cooperation, respect, and the recognition that every species has value regardless of their age or current limitations. Watch the princess work, remembering the contempt in her voice just hours earlier when she had declared humanity worthless. Now that same voice was proposing to revolutionize galactic civilization based on principles that he had tried to defend through his simple act of defiance. Perhaps, he thought, hope really was humanity's greatest contribution to the galaxy. And perhaps, sometimes, the courage to walk away from disrespect could open doors to possibilities that no one had imagined before. The future of interstellar civilization was about to be written, and it was starting with a human ambassador who had dared to believe that dignity was more important than diplomacy.